On the line today is the author of the best-selling Escaping from Eden, Paul Anthony Wallis. So Paul, can you say something about your background and what you're researching and writing about?
Thanks so much for having me on your show today. I'm in Canberra, the sunny capital of Australia, and I'm a researcher and an author. My background is in Christian ministry. I spent 33 years working as a church doctor, as a theological educator, and as an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And in recent years, I've taken the opportunity to drill down a little further into my biblical studies, and it's that's opened up this huge world of other phenomena, other stories that are part of our cultural heritage all around the world, stories that open up the question of who we are, where we came from, what is the story of human origins, and what's the story of human potential. And I guess it's that last bit that really excites me, the idea that we might be able to live better and live differently in the light of things we're discovering from the past. The red pill for me to open all that up was through studying the texts of Genesis, finding some anomalies that opened up a whole other story. And that's what Escaping from Eden is all about, sharing that journey.
I've got a couple of questions from listeners for you. This is from Aidan in Port Macquarie. Paul, I like your material on Fifth Kind TV, but I struggle a bit when you quote from the Bible. I grew up with a strict Catholic education and I find it a bit of a stumbling block. Everything I heard was about judgment and hell, and that just didn't ring true to me. So these days, I really don't have any interest in religion. But am I missing out on another way to read the Bible? What am I missing?
That's a great question. And I think, a lot of people avoid going anywhere near the Bible because they are so familiar with how it's been taught, how it's been translated, how it's been used, really as a means of controlling people, of trying to manipulate people into being good citizens. Whereas, in fact, when you drill down into the translation, when you read it alongside its sources, it's actually a profoundly empowering sequence of stories when you think through the implications of them. And if people knew what these stories were really about, they would be full of appetite for those texts. And I hope after reading Escaping from Eden, people will go back and say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was there. But once you've taken the red pill of certain translation points, it's very difficult to go back and read it the traditional religious way, which, as you say, is all about filling people with fear of hell, fear of consequences, or I'd better get it right. And it's a very diminishing kind of lesson that people come away with.
Human beings, we can be incredibly loving and wise. Other times, our reptilian brain seems to trap us and we get locked into fright or flight. How do our mythologies speak to that?
Oh, wow. We could talk for hours just on that last point. And yes, I'm with you. The story that you've just described is, I think, the most beautifully told in the Mesoamerican narrative of the Popol Vuh, which was the story that came from the tradition of the Mayan priesthood. And they had this story that had been pushed underground when the Catholic forces went into South America, the forces from Portugal and Spain. They took over. They decided what was fact, what was fiction. They became the educators and the news agency, and all other stories and explanations had to be pushed aside. So all of a sudden, the Christian story was going to be taught. And this earlier story of the Popol Vuh went underground for about 10 generations. And then a Dominican friar was entrusted with that story in the ancient Quiché text. He was a linguist. He was able to navigate his way through it. And the story that emerged from that, we have a planet that appears to be in like a post-apocalyptic state. It's flooded, it's shrouded in darkness, and then these beings arrive from somewhere else. And they hover over the waters and they have discussions about how they're going to re-nurture life on Earth. And part of what they do is to engineer a species that becomes Homo sapiens. And it's very honest in the way it tells the story, I think, because it says they had a number of goes at it and they didn't get it right. And they made some mistakes and didn't go so well. And finally, they produced a species that was a little bit better than we are now. Us, plus we could remote view, plus the telepathic connection, plus some precognition. And obviously, these visitors whose intention was to create, their phrase was, make avatars for ourselves, to do the work and bring us our food. And all of a sudden they had a species that did not want to work for superiors like that because they were too smart, too clever. And if they've got precognition, how on earth do you manage them and herd them? And so they have a quick emergency meeting and say, these Homo sapiens, we'll call them Homo sapiens Quetzalcoatlus, because Quetzalcoatl is the figure who had engineered them. We've got to dumb them down. Let's take away that telepathy, that remote viewing, that self-healing capacity, that precognition. And they came up, so the story goes, with some kind of a mist that if they sprayed it over the human population, it had effects on our neurology and dialed us all down to the level most of us operate at now. And it's very interesting, you mentioned the reptile brain, one of the most primitive parts of our brain, apparently, so the scientists tell us. That's all you need to be able to manage and manipulate a species. If they've got fear, if they've got fright, flight, fight built into them, then you can manage and manipulate them. And that's where we were taken back down to. But what I find really interesting is that the tradition that curated that story also curated shamanic and mystical practices that are designed to switch those inhibitors off and dial us back up to a higher level of consciousness. So that strand, that tradition, the Mayan Mesoamerican, is really, really rich. When I read that, it took me back to Genesis to read stories like the Babel story and the flood story in a different light. And even back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 differently, because the Mesoamerican story, the Sumerian story, they all talk about us being a slave species for another more advanced species. And so I went back to Genesis and read this little verse that said that the powerful ones put the humans to work in Eden. And I thought, that doesn't mean light gardening, does it?
Mark from Bournemouth writes about how sometimes truth gets told in fiction. He says, in the movie The Fifth Element, you have the story of the gathering of the stones. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, you've got the gathering of the 3 rings of precious metal. Is this pure fiction?
The idea that metals might act as communication devices, as things that alter our consciousness and allow us to receive communication, you can find in ancestral narratives all around the world. And it's there in the pages of the Bible as well. You've got devices named in the Hebrew texts where crystals and metals are used as communication devices. So I'm talking about Thummim, I'm talking about the Ark of the Covenant, metal technology for communication. You mentioned Tolkien and the story of the rings in Tolkien. Anyone who has really read Tolkien resonates with it in a way that is not purely at the level of fiction. And in the research that I've done for Escaping from Eden, I've come to the conclusion there's far less fiction in the world than we generally think. All kinds of truth gets spoken in the guise of fiction. And a little study of Tolkien, you'll understand that his state of mind was exactly that. that you could tell the truth in fiction. The story of rings affecting consciousness, having different roles, needing to come together, is not only in Tolkien. That's a story that keeps resurfacing and resurfacing in culture after culture, generation after generation, and you have to ask why. Why does this story keep coming back? And it's because there's truth in it. When you go to Plato, he was very clear and very enigmatic at the same time that Atlantis was built on metal technologies, the mining and manipulation of metals. And there's an intriguing reference to the historic Atlantis at a site in Spain, at Canchoruano, which has what appears to be a miniature model of what may have been Atlantis, and with a temple at the heart of that indicates that the manipulation of metals was at the heart of what that culture and civilization was about. In Plato, he says the entire civilization, the entire culture disappeared within a night and a day, and yet that archaeological reference that we have in Spain, and the fact that Plato says he got this information via the ancient Egyptian priesthood, suggests that there was indeed an exportation of people, ideas, and knowledge from Atlantis into the wider world.
So do you think in ancient times, cultures around the world were more connected than we've given them credit for?
Oh, absolutely. I think the evidence of a global culture, a global civilization, prior to the civilizations we know about, is becoming overwhelming. We get taught the story that civilization began 7,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and yet we keep digging up evidences of civilization prior to that. It's there in Plato, and we've got archaeology all around the world confirming it. You can look at Yonaguni-jima off the coast of Japan, off the coast of Malta, off the coast of Cuba, the Gulf of Cambay off the coast of India, and we can find the megalithic remains. Those places would have been above sea level no more recently than 10,000 years ago. At Göbekli Tepe, you've got, again, more evidence of a culture that seems to be coming to a close around 10,000 years ago that existed prior. If you go into the Andes, there's evidence of a massive scale civilization connecting the ones we know about that's far more ancient. Plato had this in the category of things he said he believed but he could not prove, and it was something that he had got, I believe, from an ancient Egyptian source, and that was that Earth is a globe floating in space, a little bit vulnerably because from time to time the movement of things in space impact us and create extinction level events. And so there's a periodic resetting of civilization. He reckoned it was every 5,000 years or so. And so right away, he's affirming the idea of this cyclic story, that there have been a number of civilizations prior to this one. If you go to the Hebrew tradition, there's a wonderful and a mysterious text called Ecclesiastes. I say mysterious because there are hints that comes from a Sumerian source ultimately. And the writer there says, we have no knowledge of who went before us, and after a time, no one will have any knowledge of us. Now, when he wrote that, they had history, they had writing. So he's not talking about individuals, he's talking about civilizations. And as I did my work through the book of Genesis, it seemed to me, once I'd done some translation work, that by the time you get to the end of Genesis 11, you've read the story of at least three planetary resets, three resets of civilization. And so these stories from different sources all reconfirm each other, that there are civilizations far more ancient than the ones we officially know about. We can piece some knowledge together, and we can go far, far back into geological time with that thought in mind. Scientists today are saying that people who are our size and shape and form have been around for 200,000 years. Well, that's enough time for a few resets. And then if we go back before then, if there had been a civilization before human prehistory, we wouldn't know because it would be embedded within a few millimeters of strata. But we know enough from what our ancestral narratives have recalled to know that there's been a sequence of civilizations and that there may be pivot points at which some of the culture and knowledge of the previous civilization comes into the current one.
Paul, I love your story about grounding or earthing. Am I right it was your lovely wife Ruth who turned you onto the power of earthing?
I learned about earthing through developing sleep apnea. And I had, through my life, always preferred to be barefoot. I'd never been very into shoes. And so I'd always made earthing and grounding part of my life. And I didn't know why. I didn't quite understand what the theory was behind it. And then with my sleep apnea, I was going to go and hire one of these CPAP machines, which looks like a life support machine. It's not very nice for my poor wife sleeping next to that. So when I said to Ruthie, I really need to give that CPAP machine another go, she said, would you try doing more earthing instead? And so we bought an earthing mat, which goes on our bed. And what it does is it simply connects you with the earth. The same way that you would earth an electrical device, it earths you, walking barefoot, sitting on a sleeping mat, and it regularizes your body's electromagnetic field. So I was working with that, and I was spending more time out in nature as well, walking in the bush. And it was after I'd been doing that a little while that I started having sudden flashes of remote viewing and precognition, and it related to this earthing thing. And it was out of the box for me. I'd experienced remote viewing and precognition before, but I'd always somehow squeezed that into a religious storyline of the spirit imparting things for the purpose of ministry. This wasn't that at all. This was my brain switching back on and a different level of consciousness happening. Now I understand why people like Francis of Assisi, St. John of the Cross, were so committed to going barefoot and why their level of consciousness was so different to the people around them for that reason. So, I mean, this ties in with Aboriginal cultures around the world. Native Americans will tell you about it. And it was only having experienced it that I thought, I need to work out why that's happened, what it means, and how I can learn more about it. So that's where that story comes from.
You were saying earlier about Lord of the Rings and saying there might be some non-fiction hidden in their story. In Escaping from Eden, you do a bit of that yourself. Is that a trick you got from Plato?
Plato certainly does that, because in Timaeus and Critias, which is the book that talks about Atlantis, and in Phaedo, he presents them as conversations. Well, clearly, it's not a verbatim recollection of real conversations. It's fiction. And yet he's teaching real stuff. He's teaching the teaching of Socrates. Of course, it's all his own teaching as well. Otherwise, he wouldn't be writing the book. And so he's a great example of, here's a work of fiction that's telling the truth and giving us profound truths about reality. I wrote a book about 20 years ago called My Dinner with Anton. It's fiction. There wasn't really a 250-year-old monk called Anton. I didn't have dinner with him in Camden Town. But we are telling the real story of real history, a real figure, Seraphim of Sarof. And when I came up with that way of telling the story, of course, I thought I was a genius. I thought I'd invented a new form of literature, not knowing people have been writing that way for 2,500 years. Well, once you realize that someone with the standing of Plato is using fiction to teach fact, it makes you go back to other literature that you've resonated with and you ask why. Or why has this story lasted? People watch a movie like The Matrix and they come away thinking, this is telling me something real. What have I just been told? And then they'll puzzle over it to work out what are the truths being told in this fiction. So many stories like that I could think of. Planet of the Apes, The Jungle Book, Tarzan, Lord of the Rings. We all have a sense of there's something in this that has caused it to survive. It is speaking to us something that is more than a story. And sometimes that happens because the writer is downloading information without knowing that's what he's doing. Sometimes the writer will have channeled that information, and sometimes the writer will have privileged information that they're now going to share with the world in the form of a story. That happens all the time.
Now, Paul, we're having a very strange 2020. Things have really got darker. There's the health concern around the world. And then on top of that, I think more people are worried about the 1%, the cabal. And if there's something even more worrying happening behind the scenes, taking us in a darker direction, it feels like we're moving towards some kind of tipping point. And it's scary because most of us feel pretty disempowered. So in all this, how do we look after our own state of mind?
What you're talking about goes back to Gnosticism, because there are texts out of that tradition that talk about the role of these energy-based entities that influence, you talk about the cabal, that influence people with strings to pull. And there are stories about entities known as archons that feed off what we would describe as lower vibrational energies. They feed off anger, rage, anxiety, sadness, and they manipulate human thinking and human consciousness to get us to behave in those ways so they can feed off those things. And so it is a struggle we're caught in perpetually of learning to operate at a level where we're not manipulated, at a higher level, which is to do with love and harmony and altruism. And when we do that, we are far less able to be manipulated. We all understand that when powers want to manipulate human beings, they try and keep us anxious, overbusy, or sick. Then we can be managed. So we understand that even at a human level. Well, our ancient narratives, including the Gnostic ones, say there's a whole other layer to that story. When you go to Plato, he talks about us as conscious beings currently having a material human experience, and the lesson that we're needing to learn in this life or through this life is how to free ourselves from what he described as the heavier emotions. Heavier emotions like selfishness, ambition, rage, unforgiveness, depression, sadness. We have to learn to shake those off. And if we can shake those off, and the emotion that undergirds all of that is fear, if we can shake all of that off, then we can live the kind of life that we all have the potential to live. That really is the call on us right now. A lot of people are coming to a crunch point for themselves through this situation where they're being confronted with the question of, am I going to cave in to fear and anxiety, or am I going to find a way of moving towards love and living a life that's really worth living? People are being confronted with that question at the moment because of how much has been put on us in this situation. And so there is some waking up going on that I am seeing in and around me, and I'm hopeful that more and more people are wrestling with that question that Plato says is the real deal. Can we shake off the heavier emotion, the stuff that pulls us down? Can we elevate ourselves into something that is more human, more hopeful, more loving, more harmonious? And if we can, then we will avoid the tipping point taking us the wrong way.
I can hear the crew making some noises of agreement. In 2020, though, it can leave us feeling very much like a world of individuals, and we feel very separated. In reality, Plato said that we're all part of the same big consciousness. So what's the reality? Are we separate beings? Is it all about me making my individual hero's journey? Or are we really all one?
You and I are having individual experiences. We also experience a sense of connection. But that's because the one consciousness is experiencing through us.
It's experiencing itself?
It's experiencing itself, that's right. through us. So consciousness is experiencing individuality. And so I think the great question upon us as a group of consciousnesses is, can we do that as a plurality of beings apparently with free choice? But ultimately, the big picture is that it's a single consciousness asking itself the question and experiencing the answer. So in a sense, our separateness is an illusion, but I think it's part of the story that we are having this material experience. We are having this individual experience, but it's part of a cosmic journey of oneness. At some point, we'll all be coming together and comparing notes. What I love about this moment in the story is when you and I get a sense of non-separation. You know, we're brought up to believe in individuality and separation. Each of us is on a lone hero's journey. But every so often we catch a glimpse of, no, there's another layer to this story. And I have a phenomenal and inexplicable connection with you and you and you, and with the nature around me and with the animals around me. And we get glimpses that tell us the bigger story is of oneness. And as we experience that and turn on to that, our experience of this material chapter is elevated.
You can check Paul out on fifthkind.tv. That's 5thkind.tv, and on the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube. And you can find his book, Escaping from Eden, on Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble, and all good bookstores. Until next time, ciao.